Coming right up on the Van Maren Show, we have an interview with Dr. Joseph Pearce, who once spent time with Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and tells us what we can learn from one of the greatest men of the 20th century about where we are today, what comes next, and how we should live our lives. That's coming right up. Hello everyone, my name is Jonathon Van Maren and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Many of you will be familiar with Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, the author of Gulag Archipelago, the Nobel Prize recipient for literature, and one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Well, I wanted to have a discussion about him and what we can learn from his life and his work on this podcast, and so I contacted Joseph Pearce, who's a wonderful writer in his own right. He penned a brilliant biography of Solzhenitsyn, which I recommend to everybody, called Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. He's also written The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, and a wonderful biography of G.K. Chesterton. So Joseph Pearce agreed to come on the podcast to have a conversation about Solzhenitsyn, his personal experiences with the man in the course of writing the biography, and this is that conversation. Well, I'll start off then by asking you, how did you first become interested in Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn?
Well, actually, years ago, I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love, which tells the story. But basically, when I was 15 years old, I was involved in radical politics and was, I suppose you could say, a neo-Nazi. So I was very anti-communist, but not necessarily for the right reasons. But in the 70s, when I was a teenager, I first read the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and it really did give a rationale for why communism was evil on a much deeper level and a historical level, which was life-changing for me. So I read more by Solzhenitsyn as a youngster, and then I had my disillusionment with radical politics and my conversion to Catholicism. And then shortly after my conversion to Catholicism, when I was probably in my late 20s or early 30s, Solzhenitsyn wrote a new book called Rebuilding Russia, which I was intrigued to find that his ideas were very similar to the distributist ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, and very much in tune with the papal encyclicals by Leo XIII and Pius XI. So this rekindled my interest in him, and so then that meant I read all of his newer stuff and eventually wrote to him, which is why I came to write my biography of him.
So we're going to get into that in a minute. But first, just for our listeners and our viewers, I feel like Solzhenitsyn was very well known 25 years ago in conservative circles because the key conflict that defined conservatism at the time was the West versus the Soviet Union, or the West versus communism, freedom versus slavery, that sort of thing. And, you know, there's a lot of different conservative writers who actually attribute their conservative conversion to Solzhenitsyn's work, the Gulag Archipelago. But now, when things are much different, and in fact, your history in radical politics probably has more bearing on some of the current conflicts going on than Solzhenitsyn does, Solzhenitsyn isn't as well remembered now as he was 25 years ago. The one resurgence that he's had for those who aren't interested in history like I am is that Dr. Jordan Peterson has really been pushing Solzhenitsyn as somebody who's essential to read, because Solzhenitsyn, for Peterson, who's something of a secular Calvinist, helps to explain why people cannot be trusted. And he wrote the foreword to the newly released edition of the Gulag Archipelago. But for those who aren't really familiar with him, tell us a bit about Solzhenitsyn's life and why he is such an important figure, such a key figure.
I would happily do that, but if I could just put one caveat upon what you just said. I mean, basically, you're essentially correct, but a couple of caveats. First of all, that Solzhenitsyn is extremely well known in his homeland of Russia.
Yes.
These days, and has had a huge influence, and obviously a beneficial one, in leading Russia out of the communist past. The Gulag Archipelago, in an abridged form approved by Solzhenitsyn's widow, is actually compulsory reading for all Russian high school students. So every Russian high school student is actually getting Solzhenitsyn's experience of the Soviet tyranny. So he's very influential in his homeland. And I will say, yes, Jordan Peterson definitely, but the University of Notre Dame Press is publishing posthumously some of Solzhenitsyn's work. Dr. Daniel Mahoney at Assumption College is doing some wonderful work as well, which is getting recognition. So yes, but is what I would say to that. Now, as regard why everybody should know who Solzhenitsyn was, I think, you know, these things are complex and complicated. But if you want to know who are the central figures in helping to bring down the Soviet Empire, now you could argue that politically and historically, the sort of axis between St. John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, we're ably assisted, if you like, as a triumvirate by Margaret Thatcher, was a major contributor to bringing down the communist empire. Regardless of what we think, by the way, of any of those people, that's a completely different issue. Yeah. But the other person that stands up as a giant, as a witness, who helped to undermine the legitimacy ethically and morally in the minds of people in the West to the Soviet Union, was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. So my generation, growing up as a teenager in the 70s, Solzhenitsyn was so well known that just his picture in the newspaper was sufficient for you to recognize him. You didn't even need a caption. He's one of those faces that was globally recognized as one of the major celebrities of his time. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. So a major figure in the 70s. The defining moment for me, and what defines a good so-called conservative from a bad so-called conservative, I don't actually like the label, is what they think of Solzhenitsyn's Harvard address in 1978. Ah,
yes.
Yeah, because Solzhenitsyn, gave this address at Harvard, shocked a certain type of conservative, and certainly shocked the liberal ascendancy by his critique of Western society, saying, yes, communism is evil, but don't be smug, because there's plenty of things wrong in the United States and in Western Europe that we need to put right. And that, for defenders of liberalism in its various forms, was a shocking thing to hear, and they turned on him. And I think in many respects, prior to that Harvard address, Solzhenitsyn was a hero who was sort of liked by people on the left and right. Following the Harvard address, he polarized opinion, and certainly the Western establishment turned on him.
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because you're getting to something I wanted to get into in more depth later, because his warning to the West, his Harvard address, kind of encapsulates the debate inside conservative circles in the United States today, which is this idea that no, communism is the great evil, but unfettered capitalism, total access to free markets, these things can also end up crushing people, and that's what we're starting to see now. And the National Review actually republished the address in its entirety again last year, drew attention to Solzhenitsyn's Harvard address to remind people that it was still relevant, whether or not you hated what he had to say, it was still relevant. But let's give the listeners a bit of a chronology. So he was born, I believe, during the Revolution. His father had died during the First World War. Give us a bit of his life story from there.
Yeah, so he was actually born at the end of 1918, so 1 year after the Bolshevik Revolution, but in the midst of the civil war that ripped Russia apart following the revolution. His father actually died in a hunting accident while Solzhenitsyn was in utero. So while his mother was pregnant with him, his father died in a hunting accident. So he was basically an orphan. He was fatherless from birth, raised by his mother, grandmother, aunts. But of course brainwashed, because he was born into this atheistic utopian society and brainwashed into philosophical materialism. By the time he was a teenager, he was an atheist. He was involved with the Young Communists. And, you know, that's why he considered his arrest to be a blessing. Because for Solzhenitsyn, you know, whatever suffering was necessary to bring someone to the truth was a small price to pay for the truth itself. So for him, being arrested, being sent to prison was a blessing, because rather live a life of suffering or even die knowing the truth, rather than living in a lie and being ignorant of the truth.
So what did he get sent to the Gulag for, right? When we look at Solzhenitsyn's career, how did his career as a writer start? And then how did he end up as an atheist, faithful member of the Soviet Union, to somebody who ended up getting sent to the Gulag archipelago, and then eventually, of course, he became one of the Soviet Union's most prominent opponents overseas, if not the most prominent opponent overseas.
Yeah, certainly he was the most prominent opponent overseas during the period of the late 60s and 70s, no doubt about that at all. I would say I would answer the question first on the macro metaphysical level, because what Solzhenitsyn insists upon is there are certain key moments, turning points, pivotal moments in his life, and they were all connected with suffering. So the first was the arrest. One of the first, he says, was the experience in the war on the East Prussian front with the Red Army against the retreating Germans, and the acts of rape, of suicide on the part of Russians who were arrested that were fighting for the Germans against the communists. This experience of suffering and of war was the first defining moment. Then the arrest, and to answer part of the bigger question you asked, he was arrested for the hideous crime of criticizing Stalin, actually fairly mildly, in private correspondence to a friend. And of course, in the Soviet Union, there's no such thing as private correspondence, which, by the way, in the age of Google, there's no such thing as private correspondence now either. But that's another matter. We're not at the moment being arrested for what we say in emails, but it could happen. But basically, he was arrested for writing privately to a friend while he was serving in the army in World War II, something which was mildly critical of Stalin. That was enough to get him 7 years hard labor. And so the second thing, suffering, was the arrest. And then the third thing was being diagnosed at the end of his prison sentence with what was believed to be terminal cancer. So at this point, he believes he's dying. And this precipitated his conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, his Christian conversion, and that, of course, changed his life completely. So on all of his writing happened, apart from things he did learning through memory when he was in prison, but all of his published writing basically happened after his conversion. So he's always a Christian writer.
Describe for us a bit about the experience that he had in the Gulag, especially because his description of that experience later on would inspire so many people to become conservative, to reject communism. And so those experiences not only defined his life, as you just pointed out, that suffering really defined his life, but that suffering ended up defining the view of communism in the view of millions and millions of people. So his experience there, that 7 years, I've thought before reading through Solzhenitsyn's stuff that if the communists had any idea what sending him off to the camps for 7 years of hard labor would actually do to their public image over the next 30 to 40 years, they probably would have thought better of it and just left him alone. It would have done a lot less damage to the regime. But what were some of the experiences he had working in the Gulag that ended up informing public opinion around the world on what was going on inside the Soviet Union?
Well, the first thing I would say is that Solzhenitsyn's example, real-life example, is incredibly encouraging for all of us living, you know, in, let's face it, in a world that's in crisis in so many ways. Certainly the world in which he was living was in crisis. Was certainly at least as tyrannical, if not more tyrannical than where we find ourselves now. But I've compared him as an equivalent of, an alter ego of Winston Smith, the character in George Orwell's novel 1984. But the difference is, of course, that George Orwell's character, Winston Smith, is basically crushed by the system. Big Brother wins. And not only does it kill Winston Smith, which would sort of be a Pyrrhic victory because he could still die a hero. Big Brother gets him to renege on all of his beliefs. It gets him to renege on the one woman he loves. In other words, it is complete and utter spiritual as well as material victory over him. It's basically the victory of nihilism and the victory of despair. But it's a work of fiction. Solzhenitsyn, at the very time that Orwell is writing that book, is in a real-life prison and a real-life Big Brother tyranny, and has decided himself that he will single-handedly take on the monster, fight the dragon, and will win. Now, you'd have thought that's an act of madness, right? And nobody would believe it, even in a work of fiction. George Orwell's position is more realistic than Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's. And yet what is actually reality? Historical reality is that the one man, with courage and using his God-given gifts and being, if you like, guided and guarded by Providence, can actually overthrow the dragon. And that's the very encouraging lesson I think we get from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's life.
Now, it's interesting. I want to get more into his life in a moment, but I want to pull on a thread that you just tugged loose there. One of the interesting books I read last year was a book by Douglas Murray called The Madness of Crowds, where he's taking a look at the speech codes and sort of the top-down enforcement of wokeness in society. And one of the things that he said, I had him on this podcast last year, one of the things that he said that I found very interesting and actually applies directly to what you're saying about Solzhenitsyn and George Orwell's 1984, is he said that one of the reasons that the powers that be, that the elites need to force people to not only believe what they believe, but to verbalize what they verbalize. So you need to call a biological male a female, even if you know that not to be the case. You have to say phrases like pregnant men, phrases like her penis. Those are phrases that you have to say that are published in newspapers. And I'd never really thought about it from this angle before, but Douglas Murray says one of the reasons they have to force people to say it is because when you force people to say something they know and not to be true, it is profoundly demoralizing and humiliating, and it contributes to the breaking of their spirit. That was an angle I had not considered before, the idea of forcing people to say things they know to be a lie as a method of demoralizing and crushing them. What do you think Solzhenitsyn's experience and George Orwell's 1984 have to tell us about the age that we live in now? This is a diversion, but I think a worthwhile one.
Well, yeah, I think it is certainly a worthwhile diversion or tangent, because it does relate to what we're talking about here, is that we are actually living in tyrannical times. It is basically impossible now for someone who believes what humanity's always believed about humanity to actually have a position in a secular university or college. They will be fired. And they're not even allowed anymore to remain silent. As you say, they have to pay lip service to it, and literal lip service. They have to speak openly that they conform to this nightmare ideology. So it's the similarities with Soviet communism are palpable and really unmistakable. That's why it takes courage. And that's why I think the Solzhenitsyn can be a great inspiration for us, because he shows us that when things get tough, when the tyranny starts tightening the screws on the dissidents within its midst in the West, that we have to have the courage of our convictions. We have to understand that the word martyr means witness, and we have to embrace martyrdom if that is what's necessary. As Solzhenitsyn did. He was willing to die in order to fight the dragon. By the grace of God, he lived to a ripe old age, but he might not have done.
So if you want to tread water in the quicksand with me for a moment on that subject, one of the things that I find interesting, because I do want to get into his warning to the West, is that Solzhenitsyn now, like when he passed away, all of his obituaries and eulogies had to mention the fact that he was a supporter of Vladimir Putin. And one of the things I found interesting is, so a couple of years ago, I went with a friend to Russia on a research trip. We went to the Solzhenitsyn house for the diaspora in Moscow. We traveled all over the place. We interviewed a lot of members of the Russian Orthodox clergy to get an idea of what they actually thought about things in Russia. And one of the things that really came out, which I found to be fascinating, was that for them, coming out of the long dark night of Soviet communism and looking at the West, who's now once again flirting with the ideologies of Karl Marx, they kind of think that we're insane. And when you look at the headlines in our newspapers about, pregnant men and things like that. Some days one wonders why people hate the West. Other days one doesn't have to wonder, because we've become fundamentally ridiculous, especially in the eyes of prouder cultures with real histories like Russia, for whatever you think of it, is. And so one of the things that I found really interesting is that there's this idea among a lot of the Russian clergy that I spoke with that the West is on the cusp of making exactly the same mistake that the Russians already endured, went through, are now coming out of, and that to a degree the West and Russia are changing places. Vladimir Putin, although his faith is obviously not the orthodox sort, because he openly says in interviews that he sees Russian Orthodoxy as a decent replacement for communism as a unifying national ideal rather than as a personal faith. What do you think of this idea that Russia has seen what they've gone through, are rejecting it, just as the West is accepting a lot of those ideas that wreaked such havoc for so long?
Well, there's a few things I'd like to say in response to that. The first is that Solzhenitsyn, when he visited Italy shortly after he was exiled from the Soviet Union, was, I don't know if alarmed is the right word, but certainly disappointed to see the amount of communist graffiti in Italian cities on the walls. And his response was, a dose of the real thing would do them good. In other words, that these people do not understand the fire that they're playing with. And I've certainly, the part of the tyranny in which we're living is to keep people ignorant of the past, because the past teaches us wisdom. It's the collective experience of humanity. We've talked about the history of Western civilization for 3,000 years, Christendom for 2,000 years. So this teaches us to understand who we are. If you want to start with a utopia and a tabula rasa that you can reinvent the human on, you have to make people ignorant of the past, ignorant of history. And that's why we're seeing the reemergence amongst those who know nothing about history, the young people, of admiration for Karl Marx, Lenin, Che Guevara, because they're completely ignorant of the tens of millions of people killed by these people. These are the biggest mass murderers in history, and they're still getting support from young people because the young people know nothing about it. Another valuable thing about Solzhenitsyn is he's a witness that we can keep bringing out. And of course, they don't like him, and that's one of the reasons they don't like him. As regards to one other question, whether the East and the West are flipping, there's certainly an irony here. There's a divine comedy at work. I mean, we as Christians, we do know that God's in control, that everything is in his omnipresence, right? There's no future for God. There's no past for God. It's all in his omnipresence. There's a divine comedy going on, a delicious irony that now Russia is much more conservative than the West, which is much more socialist. We're playing, a crazy game here. And, let me give you an example. When you used the word penis earlier, so I assume we're allowed to use adult words on the podcast here. When the radical feminist movement, Pussy Riot, stripped down to topless in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the clergy, the Catholic clergy, and politicians and the establishment didn't know what to do. They were embarrassed because the West is so mixed up now that radical homosexual agenda it has a smell of virtue about it. So they got away with it. No one was charged. Children, people in mass had to tolerate that. But when Pussy Riot did the same thing in Moscow, they were thrown in prison, and the government passed a new law saying that, well, next time anything like that happens, when basically people are blaspheming religious spaces, they will be sent to prison for 5 years. Needless to say, there's been no recurrence of Pussy Riot's activities in sacred spaces in Moscow. So the point is, that Russia is responding in a traditional moral way to this affront on human dignity and upon religious practice, whereas the West has no courage. And that was one of the things that Solzhenitsyn spoke about, is that basically the West had lost its courage.
Well, the interesting thing that you say about that is some people might say, well, this was an infringement on Pussy Riot's freedom of speech and blah, blah, blah. But an interesting comment on how it's flipped here there's a great book by Natalia Smolkin called No Sacred Space Stays Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism. It's a really interesting book, and she talks about how a society has to believe something. It has to have a set of animating beliefs. And so in the UK and Scotland, you have people getting visited by the cops for tweeting things offensive to transgender people. And in Russia, you have Pussy Riot getting arrested for desecrating a cathedral. Regardless of what you think of Pussy Riot getting arrested, both societies have blasphemy laws. The only difference is what you're permitted to blaspheme in those societies, which is really indicative of where we're at. And look, Russia has its problems. Everybody knows this. Putin's opponents have a very bad habit of doing careless things on balconies. But at the same time, just from the ground up, looking at what the people think, it's just fascinating to me to see people who are saying that experiment didn't work. We want to reject that. You guys are obviously insane because you believe men can get pregnant. And from where I'm sitting, that is hard to disagree with. And people can say, as one recent author did, one of Putin's recent biographers, he said, Putin is just taking advantage of people's fear about progressivism to stoke anti-Western hatred. And my response to that would be, well, we're the ones giving them the fodder for the fire here. He's not making it up when he says the West can no longer identify males or females. That's something we did to ourselves, and in less than a decade.
Yeah, well, let's transcend the nitty-gritty politics and look at the big issue here, right? There's the anarchy does not exist except as a very briefly lived vacuum before tyranny takes its place. And this is summed up, by the way, perfectly and poetically by Oscar Wilde when he described anarchy as freedom's own Judas. All right, so there's always has to be law. Now, the point is, does the law protect the strong against the weak, or does it protect the weak against the strong? Now, Christianity, as the core belief of a culture, always privileges the poor, always privileges the dignity of the human person. So therefore, it actually protects the weakest in society, including, obviously, especially these days, the unborn. Now, the absence of that, what we have, the Pride movement, is basically Nietzschean, which is where right empower the strong to do what they want and to hell with the weak. That's where we're at the moment. So whose side are we on in this? Are we on the side of the whole history of humanity, which has preserved religious freedom by making an offense to desecrate an act of worship in a sacred space? Or are we on the side of radical political people who believe in marching into churches and desecrating that religious space? Because Pussy Riot are actually doing the same thing that Stalin's troops did, that the Gestapo did, that basically there was no sacred space. The state superseded religion. And going right back to Antigone and the ancient drama of Sophocles, this is a perennial issue. To what extent does the secular power have the right to usurp religious freedom? And in healthy societies, it does not have the right to do that.
So before we get more into Solzhenitsyn's warning to the West, because we took a couple of worthwhile detours here, maybe just explain to the listeners, what was the chronology? Solzhenitsyn got out of the camp, 7 years, forced labor in the Gulag Archipelago. How did his career unfold from there?
So he was released in 1952. He had cancer, from which he believed was terminal, but he made a recovery from that cancer. And from 1952 onwards, he began writing. And as Providence would have it, 1953, so just after he was released from the camps, Joseph Stalin dies. Now, there's a brief period after Stalin dies when basically everybody is so relieved that the tyrant is dead. There's a very brief period of freedom where at least not anti-communism, but anti-Stalinism was not just permitted, but encouraged. So in that brief period, following Stalin's death, Solzhenitsyn's book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was published in the early 60s. Of course, it was hugely successful. And then the communists began to realize, well, actually, anti-Stalinism is becoming anti-communism. And then the lid came down again. But by this time, Solzhenitsyn was a well-known published author, not just in Russia, but also now was known in the West. So his future books, although they were banned in the Soviet Union, were smuggled out to the West and were being published and very widely read. And even within the Soviet Union, in samizdat, in other words, in unpublished manuscript form, they were being handed around and very widely read. So basically, from the 50s and especially the 60s, Solzhenitsyn became a major voice for freedom from Soviet tyranny, both within the Soviet Union and within the wider world.
So when did the Gulag Archipelago make it out of Russia and to publication?
I think, if I remember correctly, the first issue was because it's 3 volumes. It's published in 3 volumes. Volume 1, I think, was published in 1970 and was hugely impactful and made Solzhenitsyn. And he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in the same year. At which point, really, he became, in some senses, too hot to handle for the Soviet Union, because if he was not known or not known very widely, he could just be killed. And in fact, we do know from the releasing of the KGB files following the downfall of communism that there was an assassination attempt on Solzhenitsyn, I think in 1972 or 1973, before he was exiled, which failed, actually using the same toxins that the KGB later perfected and have used successfully to assassinate other people. But he got very sick. No one knew what the reason was. He almost died but recovered. It seems that, in some ways, that God was looking after Solzhenitsyn. He gets very serious cancer, and he's healed. I hesitate to say miraculously, but it was believed to be terminal, and he was healed. And there's an attempt to assassinate him by the KGB, and he survived.
And so from there he goes to the West, correct? It's interesting, when I went to the Solzhenitsyn House for the Diaspora, I knew about his impact in regards to the reputation of the Soviet Union, the Gulag Archipelago, a lot of his literature, August 1914, the First Circle, books like that. I had not been aware of the extent of his work of gathering all of the testimonies of those who had fled Russia in exile and bringing them all together to ensure basically that there was this repository of knowledge from Russia prior to communism. I hadn't been aware of the extent of that work. It was quite phenomenal to be able to tour those facilities and to really learn in depth what Solzhenitsyn had done to preserve pre-communist Russia. The tour guide had a really interesting way of putting it. She said, if you stop and you're very quiet, his warmth is still in the building. It was really, really interesting, of course, because a lot of his personal handwriting documents and things like that were there. So when he left to the West, what did his career look like after that? He's one of the exiles, interestingly, whose love for Russia was so pure that he wanted to return the moment he could, as opposed to many others who at that point had made their peace and stayed away.
Yeah, not only did he want to return, but again, a great testimony to his faith. He believed that he would. In other words, he believed that he would outlive the Soviet monster, because obviously he wasn't expecting to be allowed back while the Soviet Union was in place. But he stated upon his exile in 1974, I fully expect to return. So, he had faith that basically the Soviet communist thing was unsustainable. Something, by the way, very brief tangent, so is this radical liberal pride thing. It's unsustainable. We don't have to destroy it. It's in the process of destroying itself. It's a long and sordid suicide, and perhaps not particularly long. But so he knew that what the Soviet Union was doing was unsustainable. He went back in 1994 and spent the last 14 years of his life back in his homeland. So when he arrived in the West in 1974, moved to Switzerland first and then to Vermont in the United States, he was lionized and lauded basically by all and sundry. But people began to be a little bit alarmed by the fact that he wasn't conforming to the Western liberal understanding of things. So, for instance, first warning signs for the liberals was he went to Spain. And at this time, Spain was still under the rule of General Franco. So, it was absolute bête noire. This was the last remnant of fascism. And he said, well, I'm astonished at how much freedom there is in Spain. There's no one stopping me from going from one, or any other Spaniard, from going one part of Spain to another part of Spain. There's all sorts of publications that I can buy that have different viewpoints that you would never get in the Soviet Union. So compared with the Soviet Union, Spain is a paradise of freedom. Now, you imagine for the left, who hate the fascism of Franco. That's an absolute nightmare scenario to have this person that everyone is seeing as a courageous hero saying things which they see as being fascist, which of course it wasn't.
Now, if you'll indulge me, I've always wanted to know this, because Solzhenitsyn has always been one of my heroes for all of the obvious cliched and boring reasons. And you actually got to meet him and spend time with him. So first of all, he was famously reclusive. He didn't talk to Western authors very much. How did you manage to not only connect with him, but get him to respond to you? And then how did he agree to spend time with you? For starters.
I've spoken about the hand of Providence in Solzhenitsyn's life. Well, I certainly see it in my own, because there's no rational reason why he should have said yes to me. At the time, first of all, I have no idea now how I found his home address in Russia. No idea how I got it. Somehow or other I did get it. And I wrote to him. And my attitude was, he's not going to reply. Mm-hmm. But I thought if he does reply, he's going to say no, but at least I'll have a letter from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and that's worth something in itself to me. So it's a win. You know, what do I have to lose? And then imagine my astonishment, because you're completely correct. Because the Western media had treated him so badly, he basically said, I'm not speaking to Western journalists anymore. I'm done. So he had not spoken to Western writers for several years. When he replies to my letter, an old-fashioned letter, saying yes, he would agree to be interviewed by me. He put me in touch with two of his sons who speak fluent English, because they were obviously educated in the United States and England, and said arranged to come to Russia to interview me for I'll cooperate with your plans for a book. So armed with this letter from Solzhenitsyn, I go to my publisher, who is HarperCollins in the UK, which is where I was living at the time. Armed with this letter, I said, you have to give me a contract to write a book on Solzhenitsyn, and you have to give me £5,000 on top to actually pay for my trip to Russia to interview him. And they looked at the letter, saw the signature, said, no problem. So I went there, I interviewed him, and why? Now, there's only two possible reasons. At the time I wrote the letter, I'd only had one book published. It was my biography of Chesterton, my first book. No other book. So I'm a nobody, right? But I mentioned that because, I mean, this is my CV, one book. So I mentioned I'd written a book on Chesterton, and I said that I don't believe, the reason I want to write a book on Solzhenitsyn, that I don't believe any of the previous biographies have paid due attention to the centrality of his Christian faith, to his orthodoxy, to his life and work. So I assumed when he said yes that he agreed with me as regards to previous Michael Scammell and some of the other biographers had not paid due deference to his the importance of his Christianity. So I assumed that was the reason, which I'm sure it was. But when I got to his home, before he came down to see me, his wife took me into a different room and showed me some bookshelves. And the top shelf was the Ignatius Press collected works of G.K. Chesterton. So Solzhenitsyn is an admirer of Chesterton. And so that magic word Chesterton, I think, was my ticket to Solzhenitsyn. So the man over my shoulder there, Chesterton, I have so much. I say that under grace, he's the single most important influence on my conversion. Or, but also he's the single most important influence probably in my getting the interview with Solzhenitsyn. I have a lot to thank that man for.
The sentence, my biography of Chesterton was my ticket to Solzhenitsyn, is quite the sentence. Because Solzhenitsyn, won the Nobel Prize in Literature, was the most powerful force opposing the Soviet Union and contributing to exposing what it was. And so if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to ask you a few questions because you've met him and he's gone, and the opportunity to meet him is now long gone. What was it like to meet him? Describe it.
Well, first of all, I mean, I was my first moments when he walked into the room, I sort of melted from being a professional writer to being a fan. Psychologically, I couldn't help it because he walks into the room. It's this person that, he's got a very distinct look. Okay. Yeah. So, so he walks into the room and I'm a fan for a moment because I overcome that. But as regards the impression of him that, if you like, countered my preconceptions. First of all, he has a great sense of humor. He has an infectious chuckle. So he would be saying things and he would chuckle. And so this was an aspect of him, the humorous Solzhenitsyn, because we normally see him as the sort of the Jeremiah prophet who's very stern and serious and telling us we're going to hell unless we change our ways.
Yeah, you spend the first 3 pages of your second edition describing that view of him.
Exactly. And so to me, this was very refreshing, right? Because, I mean, Chesterton's my kind of guy, right? Joie de vivre, this jollity, this William Booth said, founder of the Salvation Army, why should the devil have all the best tunes? Well, so Chesterton seemed to say, why should the devil have all the best jokes, right? He had fun with orthodoxy. That's me, right? I'm full of this Chester Burlockian rambunctiousness. So the sort of doer, sort of even dare want to say puritanical Solzhenitsyn was an aspect of his Solzhenitsyn's character which I sort of tolerated but didn't necessarily enjoy. But I realized when I got there, this was not the real Solzhenitsyn. And his sons told me that he has a great power to mimic, and he could mimic politicians and celebrities so well that they would literally be rolling on the floor, guffawing with laughter. It was so funny. So this sort of really rambunctious Solzhenitsyn was something I wanted to convey. The other thing about him were his eyes. When you actually held his gaze, first of all, he had very striking china blue eyes, and the thing about them was, on the surface, they seemed very youthful, almost mischievous. That chuckle seemed to be there on the surface. But if you held the gaze, you saw depths and depths of suffering and knowledge and wisdom in there. Now, of course, I don't know whether this is me subjectively projecting that, because that's how I'm receiving it psychologically, or whether it is objectively there. But either way, it reminded me, in fact, I've written books on Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings as well. It reminded me of the character of Treebeard. Grizzlebeard's Belloc, doesn't matter. Treebeard in the Lord of the Rings. And again, the oldest creature in Middle Earth, apart from Tom Bombadil, has lived for thousands of years, and yet he's got this sense of humor, but his eyes are like a well of wisdom and experience, and yet on the surface there's this joie de vivre, this joy of being alive. That is how Solzhenitsyn came across to me, and it was very refreshing, and I tried to get something of that over as far as it is possible in my biography of him.
How much time did you spend with him?
Just one weekend, but we were there all day. So I was picked up by his son Yermolai, the oldest of his 3 sons, from my hotel. He drove me out to their Solzhenitsyn's home, which is probably about maybe a half-an-hour drive outside the city in the beautiful pine woods, and we would sit around a circular table. Solzhenitsyn to my right, Yermolai to my left, a round table, and Solzhenitsyn I'd ask Solzhenitsyn questions looking at him, he'd reply looking at me, then we'd both turn to Yermolai, who would translate, because Solzhenitsyn would reply in Russian. But the other thing was very interesting was that I knew that Solzhenitsyn knew what I was saying. In other words, his English was good. I think that Solzhenitsyn, being Solzhenitsyn, he didn't want to be replying in pidgin English. He wanted precision. And he knew that his son, who was educated, I think, at Eton College, so most prestigious high school in England, and then I think at Yale University, right? So his English was impeccable, and his Russian is impeccable, because they always spoke Russian at home. That he would be more precise. But once or twice, Solzhenitsyn corrected him, basically in Russian, saying, "No, that's not what I said." And then they'd have a little exchange, and then Yermolai would rephrase the reply. So clearly Solzhenitsyn had a good grasp of English, even though he chose not to speak in it.
So when you were talking to Solzhenitsyn, and because you're writing a book, of course, and you've read the other biographies, so what you're really looking for is something nobody else has. Was there any time he said something and you thought, that's it, nobody else has that, I've got that?
Well, the key thing that I wanted to find out is, to what extent was he knowledgeable about the Catholic literary revival in the West? In other words, to what extent is he such a Russophile, or Slavophile, if you like, that he knows about the Russian thing, the Russian experience, but as regards Western culture, was he ignorant, or was he really au fait with the good things that had happened because of the Catholic revival? So, for instance, one statement he said in his interview to me, which I think is one of the best things he ever said, so this is something I'm very pleased with. I said, what about the claims that you're Slavophile and that you're opposed to the West? He said, no, I see Russia as part of the West. He said, if the Iron Curtain had come down and the cream of Western civilization had come in over the top, I would have rejoiced. He said, but the Russian curtain went up and all the dregs of Western lowlife culture came in. And that's what I oppose. In other words, he sees the problem as being the Enlightenment. He sees basically Christendom as being something that unites Russia and the West, and Christendom as Western civilization. He absolutely believes that Russia is part of that civilization, but he is opposed to the Enlightenment. And to be fair to him, Marxism, which obviously his country succumbed to, was the ideas of two German Jews who spent most of their time in England. So actually Marxism was a Western, if you like, you can say it, Western cultural imperialism, right, that the intelligentsia of Russia, who were westernized, imposed upon the Russian people. So he can even say that communism's not a Russian problem. It's an Enlightenment problem, a modern Western problem that Russia was poisoned by. So, this differentiation between Christendom, which is good, and Russia being part of this union of what it is to be a Christian is good, but the ideas of modern Western philosophy from the time of the Enlightenment onwards is evil and needs to be countered. And with that, I think we should agree with him.
So that brings me to the final subject here, which is Solzhenitsyn's warning to the West, which is looking a lot more prescient today than it did when he was giving it. Perhaps the West looked even stronger when it had communism to oppose. And so now, Peter Hitchens once said, and it's something peculiar to the way he writes, but he said, sometimes I miss the Berlin Wall because while it was up, it kept radical communism behind it and we couldn't pretend that it was something good. But once the wall came down, it's no longer contained in such a way that we can actively oppose it. I always thought that was an interesting formulation. And so what key critiques that Solzhenitsyn made of the West do you think are true today and have proved prophetic?
Well, I would actually begin by talking about some words from Cardinal Seurat's new book, The Day is Now Far Spent, where he refers to capitalism and communism as twin brothers. And the thing that they have in common, their genotype, if you like, as brothers, is materialism. Philosophical materialism. And I think that with all due deference to Pete Hitchens, I believe that the Cold War was very two-dimensional. That yes, it did keep communism in its place, but it didn't stop rampant materialism from undermining all that was good, true, and beautiful in Western civilization. So in other words, the 1960s happened during the Cold War. The beginning of the Pride movement, the sexual revolution began during the Cold War. So I think it's an oversimplification. And I rejoice that the Berlin Wall is down, and I rejoice that perhaps that the West will be rekindled, the faith of the West will be rekindled, and good, solid politics will be rekindled from the East. Because I've just come back a few weeks ago from Budapest in Hungary. There's lots of very good things happening in Central and Eastern Europe. And it may well be that now the Berlin Wall is down and these people know what communism is, that they will be the ones the light that we should be looking toward, the light in the East, if you like.
So you think Viktor Orban is the sort of politician that should give us hope?
Yes. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to completely give carte blanche endorsement to any politician. Because I know enough about politicians and politics. But I do think that what Hungary is endeavoring to do against the tyranny of the European Union, in refusing to allow mass Muslim immigration, in resisting efforts to globalize Europe to such a degree that national sovereignty no longer exists. I think that sort of resistance is necessary for the salvation of Western civilization, and in that sense, I do see Hungary as a very important, I would say, an heroic nation at the moment, fighting for the good against the tyrants.
So what would Solzhenitsyn say now, looking at sort of what looks like, stage 4 cancer in the West? If you look at, again, back to our previous conversation, once you start to say that men can get pregnant and things like this, there's not a whole lot left that you can offload at that point, when you've offloaded even, the basic concept of biological reality. So we know where this has led. What would Solzhenitsyn say about where we are now? There are certain voices that you look at and you wish you could know what they'd thought. And as somebody who met with him and spoke with him and wrote a biography of him, I thought maybe you could tell us what you think he'd say.
Well, I think he would find it difficult to resist the temptation to say "I told you so," and invite us to go back and read the Harvard address again, and see it as basically the words of a prophet, because what's come to pass, if anything, is even worse than he envisaged. But certainly it's an example of what he envisaged. But what I would say, I don't know if he would say this, but I would say it, is that what we're seeing is the destruction of pride. Pride precedes a fall. It's something which is part of a Christian understanding of reality. The movement that calls itself proud is just leading towards its own fall. What we have to worry about is what we do about it. In other words, do we have the courage to be witnesses? And the first thing we have to be is holy, because that's the greatest witness we can be, is to grow in holiness, even as the tyranny is all around us. We see it in human history, not only in the catacombs, but as an Englishman, the 300 years of persecution, including 150 years of execution that surrounded the Catholic Church in England, and the English martyrs and their witness. They're in heaven. And ultimately, let's get this right? The end of the world for all of us is when we die. I'm older than you. My eyes are already on the finishing line. Reality is in eternity. This is merely, if you like, a purgatorial staging post. We should not be too invested in the world. Evil is always in process of killing itself. Of course, it kills innocent people at the same time. That's the tragedy. But we also believe there's a judge in heaven who will ensure that justice is done. So innocent victims are not just wasted.
For those readers and listeners who haven't picked up Solzhenitsyn, I know some of his stuff is pretty tough. Some of his novels are harder to get into than others. What would you advise people start with? 'Cause I think everybody should read some of him. I don't think you can be well-rounded in terms of your reading list if you haven't read any Solzhenitsyn. Where would you advise people to start?
I agree with you. I think that if you're going to be a well-rounded reader and you talk about the 100 most important books that everybody should read, Solzhenitsyn would certainly be on that list, probably with several books. But I would say the easiest place to start, because it's the shortest, is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a very short, it's a novella, not much more than 100 pages in length, 120 or so pages. It basically covers, in sort of quasi-fictional form, because it's based upon Solzhenitsyn's own experience, and the protagonist is quite clearly a thinly veiled autobiographical Solzhenitsyn figure in some ways, that it's just one day in a labor camp. And what that means from the point of view of the human spirit. Do we surrender to the tyranny, or do we resist it? And if we resist it, how do we resist it? With a stoic pride, which is basically brittle and broken, or with a Christian resilience? And all of that is packed into that 120 or so pages. So I would certainly say start there. If you want to go further, people should at least, there's now an abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago. So the 3 volumes have been abridged into just 1 volume. And for an understanding of what secular fundamentalism can do in terms of tyranny, reading the Gulag Archipelago really is necessary.
Final question that I can't quite resist is when you look back at the time you spent with Solzhenitsyn, what's the memory that stands out?
Well, first of all, I'm moved to say Domine non sum dignus. The most important thing is that why me? I'm not worthy to have been given that great blessing, that great privilege. So for me, if I talk about what are the most important moments in my life, obviously my reception to the Catholic Church would be there. But certainly my meeting with Solzhenitsyn in Moscow would be right up there. I'm not worthy. I'm greatly privileged. And, whenever I find myself having a bad day, I count my blessings. And having met Solzhenitsyn is one of the greatest blessings I've ever received. Thank you, Lord.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure. God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Joseph Pearce, the Solzhenitsyn biographer, scholar, and author. You can check him out online. Just Google Joseph Pearce. You'll find a wealth of interesting articles that he's written. And again, I do highly recommend his biography, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. If you want to check out other shows, head over to lifesitenews.com. Click on the podcast tab. We're on YouTube. We're on all of the different podcast platforms. And you can check out past interviews. We air every week on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.